Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sunday Life. I'm excited to talk to you today about a wedding invitation. It's a very special wedding invitation that Jesus talked about in the Gospel of Matthew. How many of you have received a wedding invitation recently? We've received a couple, actually. What were you thinking when you read it? Were you happy and excited, or were you disinterested and underwhelmed by the invitation? Your reaction probably depends on how close you are with the couple that's getting married. With the invitation always comes a question. That question is, will you attend the wedding? In the parable, which I'm going to share my screen now with you, in the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew chapter 22, we're going to look at the guests that were invited to that wedding. And we're going to see how they reacted and how they responded to this. So, Matthew 22, verses 1 through 14. And to set the background for you, Jesus is in Jerusalem. This is the week that he is going to be crucified. He's telling this parable on a Wednesday morning. He'll be arrested on Thursday evening, and he'll be tried and crucified on Friday. So the hours are counting down on the time that he has left to speak to those in Jerusalem. One more thing before we read this passage is that I'm using a translation for this episode called The Voice. Now, the focus of The Voice is to be faithful to the original text and also to be true to the emotions of the narratives, to give us a readability as we're reading this passage of Scripture. Now, let's read the parable. It says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king whose son was getting married. The king organized a great feast, a huge wedding banquet, and he invited everyone he knew. The day of the wedding arrived, and on that day of the wedding, the king sent out his servants into the town to track down his guests. But when the servants approached them with the king's message, they refused to come. So the king sent another batch of servants. 'Tell those people I've invited to come to the wedding banquet. Tell them I've prepared a great feast. Everything is ready. The oxen and the fatted cattle have all been butchered. The wine is decanted, and the table is laid out just so.' And off the servants went, and they carried the king's message to the errant guest. But they still paid little attention. One guest headed into his field to work. Another sat at his desk to attend to his accounts. The rest of the guests actually turned on the servants, brutalizing them and killing them. When he learned of this, the king was furious. He sent his army to kill the murderers and burn their towns. But there was, of course, still a wedding to celebrate." So as we continue on here in verse 9, "The banquet is ready, and those I invited didn't rise to the occasion. So go into the streets and invite anyone you see. Invite everyone you meet." And the servants did just as the king had said, and went into the streets and invited everyone they met, rich and poor, good and bad, high and low, sick and well. Everyone who was invited came, and the wedding hall practically burst with guests. The king looked around the wedding party with glee, but he spotted one man who was not dressed appropriately. In fact, he was dressed rather plainly in clothes not fitting for a fine nuptial feast. The king said to the man, "Kind sir, how did you get in here without the proper suit of wedding clothes?" The man was speechless. He had been invited in off the street, after all. Getting no response, the king told his servants, "Tie him up and throw him out into the outer darkness, where there is weeping and grinding of teeth." The famous weeping and grinding of teeth. "For many are invited, but few are chosen." Now, to help us understand the meaning of this parable, there's a similar story that Jesus tells about a great feast. And we see that story in Luke chapter 14, verses 16 through 24. Now, there's a few differences between the parables, between Luke and Matthew, but we'll see that's because Matthew is writing to a Judean or Jewish audience, and Luke's audience is Greek. So in this parable, Jesus says, "A man once hosted a great banquet and invited many guests. When the time came, he sent his servant to tell the guests who had agreed to come, 'We're ready, come now.' But then every single guest began to make excuses. One said, 'Oh, I'm sorry, I just bought some land and I need to go see it.' Bought land without looking at it before you bought it. 'Please excuse me.' Another said, 'Sorry, I just bought 5 pairs of oxen. I need to go and check them out.' Again, you're buying oxen and you didn't look at them before you bought them. 'Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' Okay, him, we understand why he can't come. Just got married. No need to explain. The servant returned and reported their responses to his master. His master was angry, and he told the servants, 'Go out quickly to the streets and the alleys around town and bring the poor, the amputees, the blind, and the cripples.' The servant came back again. 'Sir, I've done as you said, but there is still more room.' And the host said, 'Well then, go out to the highways and the hedges and bring in complete strangers that you find there, until my house is completely full. One thing is for sure, not a single person on the original guest list shall enjoy this banquet.'" So here we see two parables, similar, slightly different. So then let's look at the differences between these two parables. So we're going to look at the differences between what's written in Matthew and what's written in Luke. First, we look at Matthew, and we see that this story is written about a king. And in Luke, it's a certain man. So again, because the audiences are different, the main character is important in one and not as important in another. We also see that in Matthew, we have a wedding banquet. In Luke, we have a great banquet that's being held. In Matthew, there are 2 invitations or 2 attempts at getting those who were invited to come to the wedding. And in Luke, there is only 1 invitation or 1 attempt to get the guests to come to the banquet. In Matthew, we have the refusal. The guests are disinterested and even violent. They turn around and they brutalize the servants that came and actually killed them, who came to give them that message. Where in Luke, we see that they made excuses and they didn't show up, but it was just as excuses. Then we see in Matthew that the king responded with anger, and he ended up destroying those who had committed violence against his servants. And in Luke, we see that the certain man became angry, and which led to him replacing the original guests that he had invited. Then we see in Matthew that the good and the bad are gathered to come to the wedding feast, where in Luke, we see the least are brought to the banquet. And then we see in Matthew that only a few are chosen, versus in Luke, the invited will not taste the banquet. Now, another difference just in looking at this is the overall tone of the two parables. The tone of Matthew's story is harsher than the tone in Luke's story, and that's because there was more expected of the Judeans, which was Matthew's audience, versus the Greeks, which was Luke's audience. So let's look at the meaning of Matthew's parable, and we see that the meaning is that Israel as a whole, and every Judean individually, who rejects God's invitation through John the Baptist and Jesus as their Messiah, will be condemned. You can't say the Judeans, the Jewish people, were unaware of the call of the Messiah. In rabbinic literature, it's stated that at the end of the age, Israel would enjoy a messianic banquet as they transition from one age to the next age to come. The first invitation was from the prophets and the writings, and the second invitation was from John the Baptist, whom they killed. In Matthew's parable, when the invited refuse, the king sends his servants to the streets to gather people, good and bad, to fill the wedding hall. By going into the streets, the reference is locally, meaning going to the Judeans and gathering them. But some who were gathered weren't properly attired. So even though guests were invited to the wedding and they came in off the streets, they still had to be admitted into the banquet hall. So it's apparent from the king's response that to this improperly dressed man, that he should have at least been properly dressed to be let into the banquet hall, but he wasn't. So how did he get admitted? Well, he wasn't admitted by those who were admitting people in. Therefore, he got into the wedding banquet another way, mainly by his own righteousness. But his righteousness is rags before God. Those Jewish people who try to find salvation through their own righteousness, there won't be admitted into God's banquet. There are those who try to enter the kingdom of God through the Messiah, and they'll be rejected if they're trying to enter through their own righteousness. So this is a symbol of the judgment of God according to rabbinic writings. The Judeans were aware of these writings about the messianic banquet. Now, Matthew's conclusion to this parable is that many are called, but few are chosen. Israel was called to salvation and the messianic kingdom, but they refused. The chosen are those who were brought to the wedding by the grace of God, who were properly attired by faith in Jesus Christ as their Messiah. Also, then let's look at the meaning of Luke's gospel, or not his gospel, his parable. In Luke's parable, we see that God invited Israel. This is what the Greeks would understand. The Israelites were the first ones that God invited because they were the promised people. God invited Israel to the great banquet of the Messiah, but Israel rejected God's invitation. It states plainly in Luke's story that the guest had agreed to come. Remember, we read that. They had agreed to come. They had agreed to come because they were the people of the covenant with God. They'd made a covenant with God. They were God's promised people. Therefore, God sent his servants, the disciples of Jesus, to gather the outcast of Israel and the Gentiles and bring them to the banquet. Now, the outcast of Israel, there were many Israelis living outside of Israel, outside of Palestine, living in Greek cities, living in Rome even. And as the disciples went out and preached the gospel, they were preaching the gospel to them also. So those who would reject the invitation of God, even outside of Palestine, would not be allowed to come into the banquet of the Messiah. Now, what was Luke's conclusion? It was that God is gathering Gentiles for salvation through his grace by faith in his goodness and mercy. Now, this is a shock to the Jews because this was their famous promise that they had received from God. They thought salvation was for them alone and only them. But in this parable, Jesus is he's saying that you reject the parable and God is going to go out and he's going to gather others, strangers even, who will receive and be accepted the invitation to this banquet. So though Israel has been rejected because they refused his invitation, there will be individual Jewish people that can be saved just like the Gentiles, but they have to be saved like the Gentiles. So what is the meaning of this parable to us today? The meaning is that if you haven't decided to accept God's invitation to salvation, don't make excuses. Don't say my life is too hectic right now, or I'm too busy driving the kids to soccer practice. They've got all these practices and music practice and dance lessons, and I'm too busy with my kids, or I've got a lot of things to do, a lot of things I want to accomplish first before I start, thinking about God. Or maybe a year from now, I'll be ready to come to Christ. An excuse is just an attempt to avoid accountability. just like the Jews were trying to avoid Christ. The problem with making excuses is it becomes a habit that reinforces itself so much so that it's impossible to ever be liable for our actions. If there's no accountability, then you don't need God's help. But if you don't need any help from God, then you're going to be left out in the cold darkness, literally. And for those of us who have accepted God's invitation to the wedding, we should always be mindful of those who haven't accepted the invitation of God, those who are missing out, our family members, our friends, our coworkers, even strangers that we see. We're the servants of God told to go out to the streets and to the alleys and to the highways and to the hedges and to invite everyone that we see to the wedding of God's Son. So as I close this episode, I hope that this picture of the coming great wedding feast, this parable that Jesus told, trying to explain to his audience by Israel not accepting what God was offering to them, God was going to send this message out to the highways and the byways and the alleys and the hedges because God's wedding feast was going to be filled. And the Christ and his bride, and which is the church, they would have their guest and they would be at that celebration in heaven. All who would have been saved by faith in Jesus Christ through God's grace will be at that wedding feast. We're very fortunate to be some of the chosen of God for salvation. So until the next episode of Sunday Life, may the Lord keep your heart and mind upon him as he prepares you for your eternity with him, and we celebrate that wedding feast with him. God bless you.